Welcome everyone to today's webinar on identifying and reporting spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven in New York State with iMapInvasives. And today there are two of us doing the presentation. So we have Tom Allgeier, who we'll hear from in a couple of minutes. He's the invasive species coordinator at the New York State Department of Ag and Markets. And then I am Mitchell O'Neill. I work with the iMapInvasives team at the New York Natural Heritage Program. And so the New York Natural Heritage Program, we focus a lot on uh, providing data on rare species and natural ecosystems to facilitate conservation in New York State. One of the things we do is manage the invasive species database for the state. So we help administer IMAP for the state. And so that's what I'll be talking about later in the webinar today. Just to give you an idea of how we're structuring the webinar today, I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then I'll hand it over to Tom, and he'll talk about spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven. And then I'll end it by talking about iMapInvasives at the end and how to participate in our volunteer grid square effort if you're interested. So I'll give a very brief intro now. Many of you have probably heard of spotted lanternfly. I'll go through this part really quick because Tom's gonna go into depth with this, but just to give you a primer, it's an invasive insect, has lots of potential impacts on agriculture, the environment, economy, because it feeds on a lot of native species and crop species, could end up causing us to lose a lot of potential revenue from the grape and wine industry and things like that. And they also have been kind of acting as a nuisance in areas where they become highly populous. So with swarming adults, they produce this sort of honeydew when they kind of congregate on a tree and have honeydew excrete below them. So lots of potential problems with spotted lanternfly, but I'll leave that to Tom to talk more about in a couple of minutes. So spotted lanternfly is this big problem for New York State, but luckily we are working on dealing with it. So New York State a few years ago launched this innovative effort to combat spotted lanternfly. It's sort of this coordinated statewide effort, lots of different partner organizations and professionals working together to monitor spotted lanternfly and to get a handle on where it is and how to manage it. But a hugely important piece of this effort is also everyone on this call. So volunteers, general public, all play a role in monitoring and managing spotted lanternfly in the state. So anyone in New York State can contribute records of spotted lanternfly and submit photos, and then that information is used by people like Tom and our other partners who verify those records and then use them in their invasive species plans. And I did also want to mention, so we've kind of been working with volunteers to report spotted lanternfly and its preferred host, tree of heaven, for the past couple of years. Here's a quick snapshot of last year. So we had 155 claimed locations where data was collected, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means. But we had over 155 locations where people signed up to survey for spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven, and they did record that data. And if you look at all the data we got in 2022, so including the volunteer data as well as data from our partners, we had over 100 spotted lanternfly records, over 700 tree of heaven presence records, and then over 2,000 not detected survey records for spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven. So that's showing you places where people searched for these species but did not find them. And on the map, I have the spotted lanternfly records from last year. And the green is showing where a spotted lanternfly was detected. So kind of Lower Hudson Valley, New York City, Long Island, and then a couple pockets elsewhere. So Buffalo, Ithaca, Binghamton. But you can also see there's all these yellow points. So these are really great to see. These are places where volunteers and partners have gone out and checked for spotted lanternfly, but they didn't find it. So that's very useful information to have. And it's also great to know that spotted lanternfly is not everywhere yet. So just quick thank you to all of our volunteers, if any returning volunteers are on the call today. And for anyone new, I hope you consider joining the effort for next year. So it has been relaunched. Essentially, the way it works is we have this map. There are grid squares where you can click on them and sign up to kind of adopt that grid square as your survey location. And then we just ask you to survey for spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven over the course of the year. And I'll get into the details of that later, but it has been relaunched. We've had 87 grid squares claimed so far, but there are still hundreds of grid squares that are still up for grabs. And if anyone here is returning, I did just want to note that there have been a couple of changes. So we added some grid squares, we removed some, particularly some that were intersecting with locations of rare species that we didn't want to get disturbed. So just note that if you picked a grid square last year and you're not seeing it this year, there should be some more in the region. We just did a little bit of switching. And the last thing I wanted to note in my introduction is the special challenge that's going on for NISA. So for those of you who don't know, this week is New York Invasive Species Awareness Week. There's lots of events going on across the state and two statewide webinars each day. This right here is one of them. And there are a bunch of actions that we're trying to get people to take during NISA, and some of them can get you a prize. So one of them, for example, is filling out their bingo cards that kind of have like different activities you can do, like attending an event or getting set up with iMapInvasives. But there's also, and then one of the people who fills those out will everyone who fills out that bingo card will go in for a drawing for a prize. But another way to win a prize is to participate in the mapping challenge. So for this week, and we're extending it into next week, we're encouraging people to go out and survey for spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven and report your findings to IMAP. And then the top observer will get a prize from the DEC. And I don't know exactly what the prize is this year. Last year, it was some cool stuff. So there's a little 3D puzzle of spotted lanternfly. I think there are some of those left, so that might be in the prize this year. But some cool stuff, and of course, bragging rights for being the winner of the spotted lanternfly mapping challenge. So you can learn more about NISA at nias.info/NISA. And this is just an added bonus for getting this training today. It prepares you to go out and get yourself in the running for a fun prize from DEC. And with that, I will hand it over to Tom to talk about spotted lanternfly.
Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? As I said, I'm Tom Algeier, the Invasive Species Coordinator here with New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets within the Division of Plant Industry. So I'm just going to jump right in.
Tom, it looks like you might have muted yourself.
Somehow I might have done that. Sorry, I don't know how much you missed. You missed all the wonderful parts. So New York State Ag and Markets is the lead agency. However, we are not the only agency responding to this agricultural pest, primarily in its agricultural pest. The partnerships for invasive species management, there are 8 of them throughout New York State, 8 regions. New York State DOT, New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, all the state agencies that are members of the New York State Invasive Species Council, as well as the the NGOs and local organizations that are members of the Invasive Species Advisory Committee, and community scientists like yourselves. It takes a village to combat this pest, really. So, next page. So Mitch touched on this a little bit earlier, and this is actually a photo of a submission that went through IMAP that I reviewed earlier today, and I thought it was a really great photo. It's the first photo I've seen this year of second instar nymphs. Spotted lanternfly is a plant hopper native to China and other parts of Southeast Asia. It's also invasive in other parts of the world like India and Korea, South Korea. It was first discovered in Pennsylvania in Berks County in 2014, and then has slowly spread eastward and southward since 2014. It uses straw-like mouth parts for. It has piercing, sucking mouth parts, so it pierces the plant. It doesn't really suck. It uses the plant pressure to push the sap through it, and as it digests some of that sap, some of the sap gets pushed through. So the honeydew that Mitch mentioned earlier is that sweet, sticky sap mixed with poop, basically, from the insect that filters through the insect and falls down on anything below the plant. I'll have more about that later, but just explaining what honeydew is and why it's important. They feed on about 100 different species of plants that are on all trees. That's important. They prefer tree of heaven or Atlantis altissima. My second section will be just on that one plant. But the reason why we're so concerned, and from an agricultural standpoint, is it can impact many highly valued crops such as grapes, apples, hops, maple trees, walnuts, and there's a whole list of others. Small berries like raspberries are included there as well. So next page. So the honeydew, you can see the steps there on the top left side. The bottom step has been power washed. The other two that are black and slick looking, those are all covered with honeydew. So you can see where it's a safety issue, where people could slip and fall. It's an aesthetic issue because, who wants their deck to look black and sticky? Same goes for any children's toys or patio furniture or vehicles. Anything that's under the trees that are heavily infested are really just coated with this honeydew. You can see it around the soil around that post. And some of that honeydew will actually start to ferment, which is part of the way it was first discovered in Pennsylvania when someone smelled that fermented smell, and they kind of investigated further, which also attracts stinging insects in the fall, such as European hornets and things like that, and honeybees and yellow jackets. They're attracted to that odor. But you can see that frothy white substance around the trunk of the tree that's heavily infested with adults. So that's another telltale sign, and it also impacts the plants. The bottom left corner there, you can see the sooty mold growing on so the honeydew is relatively clear, but there's a black sooty mold that will grow on that'll grow in that sugar-rich substance, the honeydew. And that black coating can inhibit photosynthesis of plants and impacts their growth that way. And it's just all around the honeydew and the black sooty mold causes quality of life issues as well as production issues. So next page. Again, you can see a little bit of the honeydew. It's kind of like the shiny part of the leaves on the right. And then also you could see how they have that swarming mass congregation habit on this apple tree and also on the grapes. And so what we're concerned about is vineyard losses. Currently, we're ranked third in grape production in the U.S., second in apple production. And then we've been encouraging hops production in New York State again for many years. Historically, there was a strong hops production in New York State. And then some diseases caused some issues. And for many decades, there were minimal, if not none, produced here in New York State. The last decade or two, hops production is being encouraged in New York and for local breweries to source local hops. And this is a pest of those plants, so it's a concern. It also has environmental and forest impacts that we're not fully understanding yet. One of them might possibly be with the regeneration of plants, particularly a thing of concern for us is sugar maple. So we're not sure how it's going to impact that. There has been some studies done, I believe, by Rutgers or Penn State. I think it was Rutgers actually. But more studies really need to be done. So next page. So where are we at now? So it's pretty widespread in New York State. It's pretty widespread in the Northeast. Here you can see the map where it's spread through most of Pennsylvania, all of New Jersey, all of Delaware, and the surrounding states as far west as Indiana. It didn't get to Indiana on its own. It was moved with some recreation equipment. It was actually an RV that was moved. The blue areas have known populations. You might see some faint little purplish dots in some of the other counties. Those are sites where either a dead adult or a single insect was found. There's no known population, but we have found single, what we call regulatory incidents. Where there's not a population, but one or two insects may have been found in locations. So the purple dots indicate those counties. And the blue counties, it's not the entire county. Like Tompkins County is lit up in New York State. The entire county is not infested with spotted lanternfly. It's one very small area. It's just a couple adjoining properties, very small location. So it don't let the map kind of scare you. It's a spotty population within those blue areas. In New York State, these are the counties that we know, all 5 boroughs in New York City. So those 5 counties, and then this relatively long list of about a third, just under a third of all New York State counties at this point. And I have the question mark in there because, we're anticipating it to spread again, unfortunately, from the areas that we know it to areas that we have not seen it yet. That's where we know it is now, but it could also be in other areas, which is why we're having this webinar. So folks like you can help us find it. So next page. Emergence prediction. USDA has this wonderful emergence prediction software that they use, and it's pretty accurate. It's not 100%. We had some anomalies with the weather this year. It got real hot and then real cold, so it threw things off a little bit. But for the most part, we're in excess of 50% of New York State is now expecting to have emergence, and about a third of the state has already seen an emergence and been confirmed. So, next slide. So when they first hatch out, they're really, really tiny. You can see the top of this. There's the top railing for a piece of patio furniture there, and they look like ticks. They're really, really, really tiny, and that's just about life size. I mean, they're really, really small when they first emerge there, and then they have a tendency to crawl up tall objects and disperse themselves into the wind. And then they find some tender new growth. Here you can see it on Atlantis. They must have hatched nearby because they're already clustering. But they're generalist feeders when they're really young because they need that tender new growth of plants. They can't really pierce, a full-grown, mature grapevine at that age, at that size. Their mouth parts aren't big enough or strong enough. So they seek out tender new growth of plants, particularly black walnut. So, next page. Emergence reports have been confirmed in the Hudson Valley on Long Island, and also in like the southern tier, basically near Broome County, Broome County and Tioga County. So basically the entire southern part of New York State, for the most part. And again, they're really, really tiny. They're hard to spot in the environment when they're that small, but they are active at this time. Next slide. So the life cycle, currently we're kind of in that bottom left quadrant there, between the eggs and the first nymphs hatching out. They're a little late this year, so we're really into early June, and we're starting to see nymphs. As the summer progresses, late spring, early summer progresses, they'll shed their exoskeleton 4 times, so they'll metamorphosize 4 times. The 4th time, they'll develop these red wing pads and red spots, so they won't be black and white any longer. They'll be black, white, and red. At that point, they're very easy to spot, and they're much larger, and they're easier to spot in the environment. That's usually when public reports really start coming in, because people are like, what is this bright red bug? Although we did have someone report a second instar, a first instar nymph as Asian longhorn beetle today. They are both black and white and glossy, but one is minuscule and one is not. So there are some other insects out there that look similar, but similar in color, but not necessarily in size. These are relatively easy to spot in the environment. The eggs could look possibly similar to spongy moth. However, these have like a waxy clay coating. In this picture, it's kind of glossy because it's a fresh coating. Over the winter, it kind of dries out and cracks. Thank you. And then they're not always covered. So the eggs look very similar to sesame seeds with a little slit. The egg masses here are new egg masses. Once they've hatched, that little dark line in the center, they kind of unzip, and that little line will be open. There will be a gap, so you can tell if that egg mass is hatched out or not. Towards the end of the summer, they'll metamorphosize one more time and complete their life cycle and become breeding adults. And then usually they feed and breed and feed and breed, and then the females will lay eggs in the fall. They persist over the winter as eggs, and for a hard frost, it takes a really hard frost, a hard freeze really, to kill them off. A frost will not kill them. It slows them down, but they continue to move around, they continue to feed, they continue to mate and lay eggs until there's a heavy freeze. So unlike a lot of insects, when we get a frost, it kills off a lot of insects. It does not with these. So that's another challenge, because they have an extended period of time when they can lay eggs. So next page. And just another visual, little infographic here kind of thing, of where we're at. So we're really in the first and second instars. As I mentioned earlier, there was the second instar reports that I've seen, and they'll progress and start to metamorphosize as the season continues. The second picture down there is a first instar nymph. I don't know if you can quite see what it's perched on. That's the tip of a spruce needle. So if you pictured a spruce tree, like a Christmas tree, or like Colorado blue spruce, the tip of one of those needles, that's what it's sitting on, to give you some idea of scale. So, all right, next page. The egg masses can be pretty well camouflaged. Here's the tree of heaven with that cantaloupe-like skin, and I don't know if you can spot the egg mass, but if Mitch clicks one more time, there you go, there it is. It blends in really, really well with the pattern of the tree of heaven bark. So, next page. They often like to lay their eggs in hidden, protected areas. So there's some cat facing on this tree, and you can't really see it too well on the left, but when you zoom in a little bit, you can see the freshly laid egg mass there behind the peeling bark, where that tree has started to heal over a wound. So that you have to look more than just on the surface. Next page. Again, the egg masses can be covered or not covered. Here's a fully covered egg mass. It looks like she was disturbed and walked away from the second egg mass that's uncovered. But it just gives you an idea. They're about 3/4 of an inch to an inch long, and the egg masses are about the same, about an inch long. And there's 40 to 70 eggs per egg mass. So, next page. Again, they like to hide their eggs under things, and they have an affinity for rusty metal. So this old car tire with the rim and tire attached on this wheel, you can see multiple egg masses that are circled. And I think there's even another one that wasn't circled. I forget where I had spotted it once before. But again, it blends in really well. It looks just like some mud, especially that one in the top center there. Looks like dried putty or maybe some dried sap. On the bottom left, you can see the contrast. You can see that some of those eggs have started to hatch, and you can see some of those that have unzipped, where the two uncovered egg masses there on the left side. That was a good example of some of the eggs that have actually hatched. That's more likely what you're likely to see this time of year, is the hatched eggs or they're about to hatch. It really depends on where you are in the state. So, next page. I mentioned about rusty metal. For whatever reason, we don't understand why. They do like protected areas, but they also like rusty metal. And once an egg mass is laid, they have a tendency to congregate egg masses in those areas. The second rib of that metal barrel, I don't know if you can barely see the egg masses, there's a whole bunch of egg masses underneath that lip. So even that little bit of protected area, that's hard to see if you're standing up and looking down. You're like, oh, there's nothing on the barrel, until you look at the bottom. But they'll fill in those protected areas and then kind of migrate out into the unprotected areas. And again, there's usually not one egg mass. There's usually multiple egg masses. Again, here on the right, a covered egg mass versus an uncovered egg mass. So in this case, the covered egg mass, depending on what surface it's laid on, that sticks out pretty well, where the uncovered egg mass blends in really well. And just don't train your thought pattern to look for the covered egg masses all the time. You have to really look for both, because sometimes it's harder to spot the uncovered ones depending on the host. So, next page. Rusty metal again is a concern for us for transportation issues. Here you can see the back of this tractor trailer. All around the parking lot housing, there's egg masses that you really wouldn't see unless you looked up at. The top surface was clear, the sides were clear, but the underside you could see there's multiple egg masses there. Railroad corridors are a huge concern for us, and you can see here the detector dogs from Lower Hudson Prism, New York, New Jersey Trail Conference detected this one egg mass on the underside of a rail. And that was, that would be very difficult for a human to spot. But again, rusty metal on protected surface, and then with the rail cars, it's really concerning for us, because if a rail car is parked there for a little while, egg masses can be laid on it, and then it can be moved pretty much anywhere. And railway beds themselves are disturbed areas, and they're prime areas to find tree of heaven growing. Recreation equipment like this camp chair or canoes, kayaks, RVs like the one that moved to Indiana, that's a threat, because that RV, those recreational pieces of equipment, whether it's a four-wheeler or a boat trailer, those that can easily be parked in an area, have egg masses laid on them, and then move to a new area and then have those egg masses hatch out accidentally. So this chair had been laying flat on the ground, so it was a protected surface. When someone stood the chair up to inspect it because they were looking for protected areas, ta-da, egg masses. But the top of the chair looked fine. So it's just something to be, cognizant of when you go to camp, or you go on vacation, or that sort of thing. To just check your equipment before and after. We don't want to spread it around. So, next page. So the take-home messages, at least for spotted lanternfly, would be, we're currently looking for egg masses, although they're hatching. And then the early instar, the first and second instars, they're going to be black and white. They're not going to have the red wing pads until later on in the season. Right now, they're really, really tiny, and they're hard to spot in the environment. So the egg masses, even if they're expended, hatched egg masses, would be easier to spot than the tiny nymphs, but the nymphs can be found. Flat protected areas, think underneath and behind things. Young tender growth, they have really small mouth parts. Think of them as babies. They can't eat steak yet. They have to go for the baby food. So they're going to go for the tender new growth. They prefer black walnut and then maple and tree of heaven. If you have a black walnut growing next to a tree of heaven, at this life stage, they're going to be on the black walnut versus the tree of heaven. They will migrate to the tree of heaven later, their preferred host, but in multiple locations, what's been observed is that young black walnut attracts the nymphs more than tree of heaven at this life stage. Rusty metal, again, for whatever reason we don't understand. at this point, why they're attracted to rusty, exposed metal, and then they like to climb tall objects and kind of launch themselves into the wind as a dispersal method. Don't be discouraged. Negative is good. Negative is a good thing. If you survey and do not find it, that's good. And we know that that area has been surveyed. Don't survey and find nothing and then don't put it into IMAP because you think it's not helpful. That data is very, very helpful because it kind of directs us away from areas that have been surveyed, and we can concentrate on areas that have not been surveyed. So, just because you don't find it, it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's a good thing. So, next page. I'm going to jump right into Tree of Heaven. So it's the preferred host. Oh, questions. Sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Tom. That was great. Yeah, Tom just went over Spotted Lanternfly. We'll do Tree of Heaven next, but we do have time for a question or two. So I see Jill has a question, so I'll read that. But anyone else, please feel free to put in your questions as well. So Jill asked, how high do egg masses go on trees?
To the top. The majority of the egg masses are going to be found higher in the tree. However, they can be found anywhere. They can be found on the ground, on the root system, underneath things, on the side rails of fences, all the way to the top of the tree canopy. However, it's much harder to survey, 40 feet up in a tree. Even with binoculars, especially during daylight, you get glare issues and things like that. It's actually easier to survey for these up in trees on cloudy days because you don't have the glare. It's also good to bring a flashlight so you can shine the light into some of the darker areas. But the egg masses can be found anywhere up into the canopy of the tree, and the majority of the egg masses will be up higher. So.
Thanks. And then I think one more question, and then we'll move on. This question is about scraping off egg masses and how to kill nymphs.
So they're not nymphs. They're nymphs. And then just because it's a different insect, if you're talking about nits. So the nymphs, same with the adults. You can crush them and squish them. If it's a new area where we don't know they exist yet, we ask that you not do that. That you capture them, put them in rubbing alcohol, and then report them, and then we can confirm them. We can't confirm a squished insect. So if it's an area where we do know they are, physically crushing them and scraping them is a great idea. With the egg masses, it gets a little more complicated because if you just scrape them off onto the ground, they can still hatch. You'll damage a percentage of them, but a percentage of them will still hatch. The best thing to do with the egg masses is to scrape them into rubbing alcohol or hand sanitizer. And since COVID, most people have readily access to hand sanitizer. Maybe a little less so these last several months, but rubbing alcohol or hand sanitizer works really great to devitalize the eggs. And scraping them, scrape them onto a piece of paper or cardboard, and then kind of put them into some sort of container with hand sanitizer or rubbing alcohol to kill them is best.
Thanks. With that, I think we'll move on to Tree of Heaven.
Sure. I'm still the same person, same agency, but we are going to talk about Tree of Heaven, Alanthus altissima. This picture kind of makes it look like this beautiful tropical-looking leaf. It is not native, obviously. It's an invasive species here in the United States, specifically here in New York. So, next page. So it was first brought here to North America in 1748 as a horticultural plant. Early plantings were in Pennsylvania. One reason why it was going to be used as a host species for silk moth, for silk production. That didn't exactly work out so well. Western settlers were taking some of those plants when they were expanding west and then planting them as street trees for shade and things like that. And some of those trees actually still exist, so there's some historic plantings there. It's also the tree that was featured in the novel by Betty Smith, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which has also been made into films and plays. So there is some cultural sensitivity or cultural value to this plant, even though it is an invasive species. In certain very limited situations, people do have a liking for this tree, although it baffles me why. But some people do like this tree. So very limited number of people. So next page. So Tree of Heaven, is, as I mentioned, is native to China and Taiwan. It tolerates poor soils, pretty much any soils. It'll thrive in urban settings. The habitat, it likes disturbed habitats. It's a wide variety of habitats, but disturbed soils particularly. It needs a lot of light, open light to get, to establish. It's pretty drought tolerant. It crowds out native plants and with its dense growth and shading. It has allelopathic compounds that prohibit other plants from growing around it, very similar to walnut. It changes the soil nutrient cycling, and it also can damage buildings with root sprouts, and concrete and sidewalks and things like that. I've actually seen it growing in the cracks of concrete, and then it'll actually expand and crack the concrete. It's a pretty tough little plant, or not so little plant actually. And Tree of Heaven, it's the primary host. It's preferred by spotted lanternfly, but spotted lanternfly can complete its life cycle on other plants. They don't do as well. The reproduction rates are much lower. The survivability rates of the young and hatch of the eggs is much lower if they do not feed on spotted lanternfly, and that's all been shown by research from USDA Otis Lab, as well as Rutgers and Cornell and Penn State. So next page. So the growth form, they can be really little saplings along, roadside ditches and things like that, or disturbed areas like railroad beds and parking lots, construction sites. Or they can be large established trees, particularly in groves. They have a tendency to grow in clumps. And they can reach up to about 80 feet tall and quite large in diameter, actually. So they're not necessarily always small trees, although that's typically what you see, the smaller trees. The common name actually comes from because it grows towards heaven, because it does grow very quickly, and it grows quite tall. So next page. So the leaf arrangement, anyone that does any plant ID, one of the first things you want to look at is the leaf arrangement. So basically the three types are alternate, opposite, or whorled. Most plants fall into the opposite or alternate leaves. Tree of Heaven is alternate, so you'll have one leaf growing on one side, a little space, and it'll grow another leaf on the other side. One thing that confuses people is that it has a compound pinnate leaf, so each leaf has leaflets. So the green part there, where it's circled, where the little thumb is, that's a telltale sign that that leaflet is from a Tree of Heaven and not from something like sumac or ash. So the main purplish stem there is the leaf stem, and then the little green parts that are attached are the leaflets, not leaves, but leaflets. And there's multiple leaflets that are also opposite along that plant stem, or the leaf stem, which is called the petiole. So, next page. Again, more about the pinnate compound leaves. You can see the difference between the opposite and the alternate there. And it's just the top and bottom side of the leaves. And next page. Again, it's not a very dark circle there, but you can see that little notch on either one of those photos. I probably should have made that outline a little darker, but they're both circled in red. So the base of each leaflet has that little red notch. That's a telltale sign that there is that it's ailanthus and not either black walnut or sumac or ash. There's also, which is very hard to see, is a little gland. It looks almost like a little dot, almost like maybe an insect egg mass, but it's actually a gland at the tip of that little notch. That's much harder to find, much harder to see, especially if your eyes are as old as mine. But those little glands are present at the tip of those notches as well. It has a very blunt base, so it's almost flat where the petiole reaches the stem, and then immediately rather, is that notch or that lump on the bottom of that leaf, that little notch, and then it smooths out, and the leaf margins are smooth after that. So, next. The seeds are samaras, just like ash and walnut. Ash and maple, not walnut, maple. Maple samaras are two-sided. The ash samaras and the tree of heaven samaras are one-sided, and they grow in clumps. The clumps are much bigger than the small clusters you see on maple trees. They're more similar to ash. So, and as they turn, when they first emerge, they're kind of green, like on the left side, and then as the summer progresses, they'll turn reddish, and then they'll dry up to a dark brown, and they can even persist after the leaves have fallen, and you'll find clumps of samaras hanging from the tree. So, next page.
And actually, do you mind if I jump in really quick? There's just a question about the leaves.
Sure.
So I just wanted to see if there's a good picture to show. So I just wanted to mention, Tom mentioned this, but this whole thing right here is considered one leaf. And
Yep.
then the little things that look like little leaves, those are leaflets. And so those are kind of occurring opposite to each other, which might be why you look at this and you're like, this is not alternate. This looks like opposite, but it's because this is the leaf.
Good.
So when you look at those big leaves, how they're arranged on the stem, they are alternating, even though the leaflets don't look like.
Thanks for adding that in. I meant to put that in there. I guess I skipped over
You
it. Sorry.
you mentioned it. I just wanted to like
No, don't.
emphasize it.
Good point. Very good point. Thank you. So, another way to identify them is their pith, or the center part of the stems. They have a. Not all stems are hollow, or it's not. It's kind of semi-hollow. It's very soft in the center, and it has a scent like burnt peanut butter, I'm told. I don't know. I don't think I've ever smelled burnt peanut butter, but I have smelled Tree of Heaven, and it does not smell good. It is a very unpleasant smell. And if you cut one of these down, it's a strong pungent odor. It's not pleasant at all. But if you break off a twig and it has pith, that's one way to tell if it's an ash or if it's a Tree of Heaven. And it has a brownish, tannish center color to it. You can see the inner bark is green, and a little light colored wood, and then the tannish brown pith, the center part of the stem. So you can break off one of the smaller stems and check that. It's another way to ID this particular plant. So, next page. The bark here is 3 examples of younger Tree of Heaven. It has a very smooth cantaloupe-like skin. It's got a slight texture to it, but they're relatively smooth, not real deep furrows. However, when they get older, much more mature, I'm talking like very large trees, like 30 inches in diameter at breast height, and larger, they do have some furrowed bark to them. So they don't always have smooth bark, but generally you're going to see smaller, younger trees, and this is the type of bark you'll see, is this cantaloupe texture. Looks almost like the bark is kind of pulling apart, and you get those lighter sections underneath. The older trees do have a little bit of a chunkier bark to them, but you don't see those very much. So, next page. Just some other things that are winter ID. Not that we're doing that now, but you might have use for this later on. So the black walnut again is opposite, but you can see that the buds are very different, especially the terminal bud. The Tree of Heaven has a very small bud, where the black walnut is going to have a center bud and 2 lateral buds very close to it. Sumac, on the other hand, is going to have very small lateral buds. The stem won't be round. It'll be kind of a flattened, multi-sided stem. And then horse chestnut, again, is going to have a very large, usually sticky bud at the end of the stem, and it's a very round stem. And horse chestnut is also opposite branching. So all the others are alternate, where the horse chestnut is opposite. And you can see the vascular bundle scars or the leaf bundle scars on the left side there. It looks like the little dot is the bud, and then where the old leaf was is almost like heart-shaped. That scarring is another telltale sign of tree of heaven. You don't really see that on the black walnut or the sumac or horse chestnut, or could be confused with. So next slide. So now sumac does have similar leaves and leaflet patterns. However, the sumac stem, the base of the leaf is not going to have that notch or that gland. So that's one thing to look at. The leaves are also much thinner, more lanceolate. So they're thinner, longer leaves, where the tree of heaven leaves are a little bit rounder, and they do have some serration, at the base, and that ends, where the sumac leaves are very smooth all around. They don't have that notch or any notches at the base. Sumac seed heads persist through the winter, and they stick straight out, and they're very almost like a cone shape. So they're very distinct compared to the seeds from a tree of heaven. The stems, again, kind of flattened. They're not really roundish. The buds are very small. They don't have those large bundle scars. And here's the picture on the right. There's a sumac growing kind of low and thick and lush on the bottom, and then a tree of heaven in the background. Very similar from a distance, especially if it's a younger a younger tree of heaven. They don't get quite as big, but you can see the contrast in the two there, where the sumac is usually more dense and the tree of heaven is more open and spaced as far as the structure of the tree goes. Next page. Again, just focusing on the walnut. The leaflets, as Mitch pointed out, and the leaflets on the walnut are going to be opposite. There's going to be fewer of them. The nuts are going to be, when they're green, they're going to have the mesocarp, the soft green coating is going to be very round. The nuts themselves are small and black or tan, where they don't look anything like the samaras on a tree of heaven. The leaf bundle scars are not heart-shaped. It looks more like almost like a tongue to me. And the buds are a little bit larger than the sumac buds. So especially the terminal bud on the walnut is much smaller. So next page. Ash trees also have compound leaves. They're going to be opposite. They're going to have 5 to 7 leaves per leaf and leaflets per leaf. It's a little bit harder to confuse them with tree of heaven, but they do have a compound leaf. So again, they're not going to have the leaf notch, but they do have some serration to their edges, and the leaf buds are not going to look anywhere near the same as tree of heaven. They won't have those heart-shaped scars. So next page. The ash tree seeds, again, they grow very, very similar to tree of heaven, especially from a distance. It's really hard to tell the difference, where the ash tree, the seed is at the base of the samara, where the tree of heaven is in the center. And the tree of heaven seeds, the samaras, are a little bit wider, where the ash tree samaras are a little bit longer. So if that helps. But from a distance, their density of the clusters, the volume of the clusters, the general shape, it's very hard to tell sometimes unless you have the seed in hand. And they're about the same size. So next page. So the take-home message is check your plants. They're not just on trees. So wild grapes, things like porcelain vine rather, are also hosts for spotted lanternflies. So don't just look at your trees, especially this time of year when things are just starting to hatch out, and they have those soft mouth parts. They'll go for any tender new growth. So really check all your plants, and again, Tree of Heaven is a preferred host, but there are many host plants. There's over 100. I think there's 100. I think there's 103, and there's 54 of those 103 that occur here in North America. So that was the most recent research that I read. So next page. So to report this, or for more additional information, iMapInvasives is really where we're encouraging folks to report it. So additional information can be found on our website, although it's very general. If you need very specific spotted lanternfly information, like what pesticides they use and things like that, the Cornell Integrated Pest Management site has a wealth of information, and we direct folks there. That map that I showed earlier of where it is in the United States, that map is also housed there, and that's updated as quickly as we can. So if you need more information, you can always refer back to the recording of this webinar. You can reach out to me, or both of these resources are available. So next page. So I think
Awesome.
I think we have, if anyone has questions, and I think we have time.
Yeah, I'll read. There's one question, so I'll read that one, and then I'll move on to our last section, and then we can do any more questions at the end.
Sure.
So Ashley asked, what is the current recommendation on removing Tree of Heaven or keeping them as track trees?
Uh, Early on, what people were doing, especially in Pennsylvania, they were removing the female trees and using 10 to 12-inch diameter male trees as trap trees. What was found is that when you cut down the trees, it disperses the spotted lanternfly. So that and at that point, it was also thought that spotted lanternfly was required for them to complete their life cycle. So what we've learned since then is that if you cut down the trees, they disperse and they just find other hosts. It just really spreads them out. If they're on Tree of Heaven, they're going to be more attracted to that tree than other trees. So you can use that tree as a trap tree. There are no effective lures at this time, although there's research going on, but there are no effective lures. So if you use one of the funnel traps for trapping them, that sort of thing, or if you're just monitoring your Tree of Heaven, that's the best use for those trees right now. So, and there's no way, it's certainly not cost effective with the volume of Tree of Heaven that's present in New York State to remove them all. It's not feasible.
Okay, thanks. So I'll move on to our last section, which I'll deliver, iMapInvasives. But please feel free to keep putting in questions in the chat, either about spotted lanternfly, Tree of Heaven, iMapInvasives, and we can get to those as well. Thanks, Tom. So, iMapInvasives. It's the centralized invasive species database in New York. It's used by PRISM, state agencies like Ag and Markets, DEC, pretty much anyone who's working on invasive species issues, trying to manage invasive species, trying to protect our natural resources from their negative impacts, all that sort of stuff. So IMAP is kind of built for reporting observations, but also for reviewing species distributions. And we also have email alerts that can be set up for people like Tom who want to keep tabs on new observations of species, and some other stuff. But today we'll mostly talk about the reporting options. But just to give you some background on IMAP, so IMAP has the capacity to store data for presence information, so where you found species, not detected information, so areas where you looked for an invasive species but didn't find it, and treatment records, so where management efforts were undertaken. And for presence records, we actually have two kinds. There's confirmed records, so those are records that have been reviewed and verified, and then unconfirmed records. So that's how records go into the database by default, and then they kind of await confirmation where one of our partners will go in and check the picture, make sure it matches, and then set it to confirmed. And one thing to note is that there is some hidden data that are not public. So for instance, unconfirmed spotted lanternfly reports go in as unconfirmed, and then once they're verified, then they become confirmed. So just to reiterate that, so all reports go into IMAP as unconfirmed. So for Tree of Heaven, you find Tree of Heaven, you take a picture, you report it to IMAP. It'll go in as unconfirmed. You can see it by logging into IMAP and looking at the unconfirmed data, but it won't be on the public map yet. Email alerts will go out to anyone who has Tree of Heaven email alerts, and then that network of confirmers will confirm that observation, and then it will be kind of part of our official distribution for the state, visible on the public map. And just to look at that pathway, but for spotted lanternfly records, those will be unconfirmed when they go in, and they'll also be confidential when they first go in. And the data, the email alerts will go out to people like Tom, who will then review it. And if they can verify that there's a population there, then it will be turned into a confirmed record and it'll go on our official public map. And so now I'll talk a little bit about the volunteer Spotted Lanternfly Tree of Heaven IMAP survey program that we've been running for our third year now. So this really came from New York State recognizing that we need help monitoring spotted lanternfly. So we do have this amazing network of agencies and nonprofits and the prisms, and other natural resource professionals who are out there surveying for invasive species like spotted lanternfly. Um, but New York State is huge, so even that sort of effort really can't cover the entire state. So we really need more eyes on the ground to kind of help spread out our monitoring efforts. Um, so that was one thing, we need more eyes on the ground. And we also want all that data going into one place, just to keep everything organized and easy to maintain. And we want to direct volunteer efforts to the locations which will best complement the statewide efforts already underway. Um, so we don't really want to be duplicating efforts. Like if Ag and Markets is performing surveys in a certain area, we don't necessarily need volunteers going there too. Kind of the idea is that volunteers are helping spread our reach over the land, kind of help us cover more area, and professionals can get the areas that volunteers aren't getting, volunteers can get the areas that professionals aren't getting, that sort of stuff. And so what we came up with was this Claim a Grid Square program. So basically, what we asked volunteers to do is set up an IMAP account, select a grid square to survey, and I forgot to update this slide. Sorry. So it's a year-long commitment. So at this, if you sign up now, it's a commitment for the 2023 season. And then you have to get ready to do your surveys, and then basically just what you have to do is survey the grid square you claimed for spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven. And all this information is on our website, but I'll just run through it quickly today. Um, and one thing we are asking people to do when they claim a grid square is to, like we want survey coverage throughout the year, but you obviously don't need to go out every day. So one thing we've done is divide the year up into a couple survey seasons. So basically, we want you to conduct a survey in your grid square at least once during each of these seasons. And you can do more if you want, particularly in the summer when there's more adults flying, or not technically flying, but they hop around and they look like they're flying. Um, Easier to see them, that sort of stuff. It's certainly not a bad idea to go out a couple times, but we're asking people to try to go out once between now and the end of June, once during the summer, so July, August, and then once in the fall. And if, I mean, we understand people travel, people have things going on, you might have to miss a season, but it's just kind of a goal that we're trying to get people to survey multiple times throughout the year, understand the different parts of the life cycle, and get a good survey each year. So I had mentioned those four steps, so I'll go over the first step, and then in I guess, a little bit of detail, and the rest will be mostly kind of a quick overview. But step one is to just create an IMAP account because the reporting tool is iMapInvasives, and to use that, you have to create an account. So basically, you just go to our website, nyimappinvasives.org, and there is a bunch of information on this website that you can look through, but the only thing I'm going to mention right now is the login button. So that's how you get to IMAP, the actual database. So you click the login button over here on the right, brings you to our login portal. And if you already have an account, you can sign up at the top. There's a forgot password option. But if you're creating your account, you do that down here. Just put in your name, email, make a password, and then select New York for your jurisdiction. One thing to note is that when you click join, that creates your account, but it's not yet active, so you won't be able to log into it just yet. It'll give you instructions about this, but you basically just have to check your email. You'll get sort of an activation email where you just click on a link and it has you open our user agreement and lets you activate your account. And once you get all of that sorted out, you'll be able to log in up here. And if you're having trouble finding that email, sometimes it ends up in your junk folder or your spam folder, depending on your email provider. But let us know if you have any issues. So once you log in, it'll look like this. It brings you right into the map. It's a very map-centric interface. There are quite a few things going on here in the interface, like there's tools on the top. For instance, you can create records right here on the online interface, kind of navigate to where you found the species, click a point on the map, and then, well, you click the create record button, and then you have the option to click a point on the map and indicate the species you found, that sort of stuff. You can turn on different layers, but that's all optional. This is not necessarily required for being an IMAP volunteer. Um, that's more about just reporting your observations, which you can do online, but you also can do on our mobile app. The only thing I'll actually point out on the login here is if you click on the main menu, you can see your account information. And this will come into play later if you want to join the volunteer program, because this is where you can see your IMAP person ID. That's kind of like your IMAP identifier for your account. Um, and you'll use that to sign up for a grid square, and you'll also use that if you end up wanting to use our Survey 123 form to report. But that's all you need to know about logging in and using the online interface. So the next part is to think about where you want to conduct your surveys. And so we have this sign up map that's available at the bottom of our web page. Um, so basically, the idea here is we divided the state into these 1 kilometer grid squares, and then our partners, including ag markets, parks, prisms, heritage program, selected some of these squares across the state where volunteer efforts would be most helpful to complement statewide efforts. So that could be because of a couple reasons. So there's these orangish grid squares. Those are kind of the most important. Those were handpicked by Tom. So areas where maybe they're near known areas where spotted lanternfly is, but not in an area where Ag and Markets is able to do surveys, like maybe their surveys are focused in different areas, um, or just other high priority areas where they feel it would be great to have volunteers checking. And there are a couple other categories. So categories selected by the prisms, or grid squares selected by the prisms. There's these purple grid squares where Tree of Heaven is already known in those locations, so those are good spots to check for spotted lanternfly. And then also some squares where we know that there's some publicly accessible land in there, so it's a good fit for volunteer surveys. So those are these blue squares. And so there's this online map that you can use. You can navigate the map with your mouse, or you can kind of type in your town or your address in the search bar, and it'll zoom into your location and pull up the the grid squares within a distance that you select. So you can kind of see where you might want to conduct your surveys. I will note, maybe you already have a place in mind that you want to conduct surveys, like a local park or something, or maybe you have some land in your backyard, that might be a good place to check for spotted lanternfly. We probably wouldn't have that on the map because we're not really focusing. We're focusing more on like uh, public land, places where we want to send volunteers. So there might not be a grid square in a location if you already have it in mind, but you can still participate. So you would just kind of skip this grid square step, but you can still certainly survey for spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven. That data is still very useful. We're just using this sign up map to kind of direct efforts to direct most volunteer efforts to certain areas where we really need help. And then step three will be uh, prepping to once you've created your account and you have your grid square, you just kind of need to prepare for your surveying. And one thing I really recommend is to think about how you're going to report your observations before you go out in the field. So it's really easy to troubleshoot and get comfortable with these reporting tools. When you're at home connected to Wi-Fi, you can download an app if you need one, that sort of stuff. But it can be really tricky if you kind of just show up on the trail and then try to download an app, but you don't have any internet and you can't find any help resources. So I really encourage you to take a couple minutes to try it out before you go out and check for spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven. So there are a couple options. For example, I briefly showed the online interface. You can just log in and then go on the map, find where you find the location on the map where you checked for the species, and then use the create record tool to create those observations right there in the online interface. That is an option. That will work better for if you kind of go out on your hike, check for spotted lanternfly, tree of heaven, come home, and then report it based on your memory. You can use it out in the fields on your phone, but it would kind of depend on what your internet connection is, how well that would work, or your service, I guess. Um, if you do plan to be going out in the field and doing surveys, it's a good idea to think about our field data collection tools. For instance, we have the iMap mobile app and an iMap Survey 123 form. These are both configured in this sort of workflow where you set up the account, get the app while you're connected to internet. These screenshots are for the mobile app, but it's kind of the same process for Survey 123. So you set up the account while you have internet connection, then you're ready to go report invasive species, whether or not you have internet connection. So you could go out somewhere where you don't have service, and you would still be able to collect observations, take photos, capture the location of those observations, and it saves those on your phone offline. And then when you get back home, have good internet again, then you need to upload those records to bring them into the online database. And again, that's how both of these reporting tools work. For most people, I think the best option is going to be the iMap mobile app. It's kind of the quick, easy method for reporting point observations, and it's what has been kind of tried and true for the past few years. So I do recommend most people to lean towards the iMap mobile app. And there's full information on our website, and there's tutorials and help docs and everything you need. For example, we have a 9-minute video that walks through the process to get set up with the app and submit a test observation. Um, and you can just find this app, the iMapInvasives mobile app, in your App Store or Play Store. But I will say there's one exception. So this is a new thing that occurred over the past few weeks. So for Android users, if you have a modern device from the past couple of years and it's running version 11 or higher, there is this new issue where new installs of the iMap app are temporarily disabled. It was a Google update that caused this. And so we are resolving this. So if you try again in a few weeks, you'll probably be able to download it. But if you're ready to go out and report observations now, I would encourage you to either use the online interface or you can use the Survey 123, um, which does everything that the mobile app does. It's just has a couple more functionalities added in as well. And sorry for the inconvenience if anyone is unable to download it, but we thank you for your patience. And I did just want to mention that all this information is on our website. So you can go here and you can see what our reporting tools are and uh, get a tutorial on the one which makes the most sense in your situation. So whether you want to report when you get back home using the map, or if you want to try out one of the mobile tools and report observations on the go. But whichever tool you use, good photos are really, really important. So it's really use. So these photos are what we use to verify iMapInvasives records. So it's really helpful if they're focused and close up. So if you can see on the left, this is a blurry photo, kind of hard to tell. It looks like it might be Tree of Heaven, but you can't really tell. And then on the right, we have this very zoomed out photo. Um, it is Tree of Heaven, but it could be hard to tell. So if you take a far away picture of a Tree of Heaven that has leaves, you might not be able to tell whether it's Tree of Heaven or Black Walnut, for example. So we really appreciate um, nice, clear, close-up photos. And then once you're ready to go out and do your survey, the last step is to just go do that survey. And so what we recommend is that within your grid square that you've claimed, identify it can just be one spot. You could do a couple spots, but at least one spot where you could do your survey. And this should be somewhere that is safe to access for you. It's publicly accessible, so like a park or a trail or something, and it's within your comfort level. So we are not asking anyone to go beyond what you're comfortable with. First priority is always just to stay safe and comfortable. And then, so you go to those spots and you just check for spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven. So, like Tom said earlier, look at flat surfaces for spotted lanternfly, including trees, but also uh, man-made objects. So those rusty metal surfaces that spotted lanternfly seems to like laying egg masses on. Um, and in particular for spotted lanternfly at this point of the year. Flat surfaces that make sense for egg masses, but for the instars, you might want to look at the young plant growth that they like to feed on, like Tom was saying. And for Tree of Heaven, uh, they really like disturbed areas, but just keep an eye on the plants and see if any of those are Tree of Heaven. And then, again, as Tom mentioned before, whether or not you find these species, we really want to know. So we really value that information. So we ask you to report it. So if you encounter either of the species, you would submit a presence record for each of those species. If you did not find them, then you would simply submit them as not detected. And there are other fields you can fill out in the records. None of them are required. The main thing is just the species, the date, the photo, if you can take one. But one of the optional fields is the amount of time you spent. So if you're able, it's always useful if you type in how much time you spent so we can kind of keep track of volunteer efforts. And one tip I'll give for once people go out to do their surveys, there is a way to say you claim the grid square today, and then 3 weeks from now you're ready to go out and do a survey, but you don't remember where you claimed. You can always go back and check. So if you go back to the sign up map and choose the Find My Claimed Grid Squares tab, you can search your IMAP person ID, which I showed you earlier. You see that when you log in to IMAP and check your account page. But then you can see your location that you picked. And there are some tools on the top that might help for this as well. So you can change the base map to satellite view, which might give you a better picture of where you're going. There's this little print icon. So you could print a PDF or print out on a piece of paper the map of where you're going. And more than anything, we just recommend you do your best. So these grid squares are set up to direct volunteer efforts generally towards areas where we need more volunteer help. But we don't need you to worry too much about whether you're exactly within your grid square. So if you're doing your surveys and it turns out they're a couple meters outside of the grid square, that's totally fine. We still really appreciate that information. We're just trying to direct people towards these general areas. And I do want to just note that I showed the IMAP interface before. This sign up grid square map is a separate thing, but it's on our website. So again, these are the 4 steps. All of this is outlined on our SLF page, so nymapinvasive.org/SLF. And again, we just ask people we try to get people to conduct surveys throughout the year by encouraging at least one survey within each of these survey seasons. And again, all on our webpage, how to use IMAP, how to sign up for a grid square, what are the survey seasons, resources for identifying the 2 species, all that good stuff is on our website. And you can also email us if you have any questions. And with that, we've gotten through today's agenda. Thank you so much to everyone for sticking with us. Hopefully you've learned how to identify the 2 species, how to use iMapInvasives. You've learned how to select a grid square if you want to join our volunteer program, and you're ready to go survey. And I'll just reiterate some take-home messages. So one thing Tom always says is that a negative survey is good. So even if you don't find anything, please still report that. We really love to see it. Jen Dean, our invasive species biologist, her tip is to, before heading out, review your grid map for spots that are safely and publicly accessible. And then my take-home message is to try to submit and upload a fake species record before you go out in the field. So we actually have this species in our database called fake species. It just exists for testing purposes. So you can just do that right from your home. Even if you don't actually see any real invasives, you can submit a record of fake species just to practice. And one other closing note, we do have this, we're really lucky in New York to have this wonderful network of organizations that cover the state, coordinating regional invasive species management and partnerships and outreach. So I really encourage you to take a look at this map and look up your PRISM if you weren't already engaged with them. So uh, they have regular partner meetings, lots of information on their website, lots of events going on each year. So I really encourage you to use these resources that are available to us in New York State. And then here's my last slide. So thank you again, everyone, for sticking with us on this Thursday afternoon. If there are any questions, please enter those in the chat. And also a big thank you to Tom for joining us today and sharing his knowledge on Tree of Heaven and Spotted Lanternfly. Open up the chat right now.
And thanks to you for hosting.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'll stop the recording for now.